Someone like Hank Green is a derivative thinker in his time, in our time. What he says, for the most part, reflects the presumed wisdom of things that everybody knows. He's not really innovating. He's not really coming up with his own perspective. He's not challenging his audience. He's not challenging himself. And therefore, there is indeed a peculiar kind of significance to his claim that veganism is morally equivalent to worrying about wasting $1 on buying a can of Coca-Cola, when instead that $1 could be donated to a charity that would help save the lives of millions of people who are dying of preventable illnesses. We all have to question the extent to which our beliefs and assumptions about reality are the byproducts of propaganda, are the byproducts of comic books, movies, TV sitcoms. And it's not something you have to question in your life just once. It's not like you turn 18, you look back at your childhood and realize you picked up a whole lot of false assumptions about the world from TV, then you never think about it again. You can think about it at 18 and at 28 and 38 and 40. And some people watching this video are probably 68. And by the end of this video, they're going to think, damn, this kid Mazard, he taught me a few new tricks. All right. If you are an English-speaking American, from what source did you get this assumption that you can save the life of a child in Africa for just $1 a day? Where does that come from? Would you deny that you learned this watching TV advertisements that said it to you during your childhood again and again and again, that this specific message, that for the cost of a cup of coffee a day, that for the cost of a can of Coca-Cola a day, yes, you can save the lives of so many people in Africa? That is a very specific advertising claim. It's a very specific propaganda claim that you've been taught thousands of times over. Even if you are Christian, you've probably heard this benediction more times than you've heard any specific prayer, more times than you've participated in any specific ceremony in any religion. This has been inculcated into you from an early age, and you have probably never stopped to question whether or not it is true. If it were true that $1 a day could make this difference in the world, the government would have already done it. If it were true that $1 a day could make this kind of difference in the world, Bill Gates would have already done it. Do you have any idea how much money Bill Gates has poured into projects, say, even in the tiny country of Cambodia, since his retirement? Since he retired, he has devoted his life to burning through millions and millions of dollars on the most miscellaneous and variegated projects imaginable. He doesn't have one narrow focus. He's trying to make the world a better place any way that he can. Not with an infinite budget, but no offense, from your perspective, the amount of money involved here seems infinite. You know what he's ended up doing? He learned over time what was possible, what was impossible. Earlier on, he actually funded some scientific experiments in Cambodia. Yeah, it's interesting to see how he's learned from success and failure of different projects. Over time, it used to be called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I don't know to what extent Bill and Melinda don't get along so well anymore, in case you hadn't heard. I don't know if they've changed the name of the foundation or not. But what used to be known as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, over time, increasingly, they became an early childhood education foundation because they found that the only difference they could make in the world was through education, which is touching, and it's also really crucially important. How would you feel if I told you that for the cost of one cup of coffee a day, for the cost of one can of Coca-Cola a day, you can eliminate tooth decay in the world? From a humanitarian perspective, tooth decay is one of the simplest problems to solve. It is much easier to solve than starvation. It is much easier to solve than providing people with safe drinking water that doesn't carry preventable diseases. It is much easier to solve than malaria. And currently, when we're talking about preventable disease, are you thinking about HIV/AIDS? Probably malaria. Probably you're thinking about malaria and cholera. I don't know what you have in mind when you talk about these preventable diseases that your dollar, your $1, your sacrifice of drinking a can of Coke could make the difference for. And again, from the perspective of someone like Hank Green, I think he is typical of his whole generation of white English-speaking Americans. People who know nothing about poverty and people who have been lulled into, this peculiar delusion. This delusion that simultaneously is a guilt trip for them, that they feel they have to live their whole life burdened with the awareness that they can never be pure enough, right? They can never live up to this standard of scrimping and saving every dollar to donate to these anonymous children in Africa, right? But on the other hand, right, apart from being a guilt trip, apart from being kind of oppressive and depressing in the sense, it's also an ego trip. It also puts you at the center of the world problems. You in your pocket, in your wallet. You have the power to change the fate of nations and change the course of destiny for millions of people. You have the power to wipe out malaria, right? You have the power to save the lives of people who otherwise die of cholera, waterborne illness, foodborne illness. And you don't. You don't even have the power to significantly impact tooth decay. You don't have the power to significantly impact crime, the murder rate. To say that you are powerless in relation to a disease like malaria is an understatement. Bill Gates is powerless. The United Nations, which, if you don't know, is divided into many different agencies. The United Nations Food Program, the United Nations this program, UNHCR, there's all these different agencies, each one of which has a budget that would even make Bill Gates blush. There is so much money pumping through United Nations agencies, right? And in case you don't know, one of the founding principles of the United Nations was that every single one of their employees would be paid more than they would earn if they had the equivalent position in the most high-paying government of any of the member nations in the world. So whatever job you do for the UN, you're paid more than you get paid if you work for the United States or Luxembourg or Switzerland. So very highly paid people in organizations with unimaginably enormous budgets. And you have the delusion, a delusion inculcated into you by television advertising, that the reason why these problems haven't been solved is because of that $1 in your pocket that you have the reckless temerity to spend on yourself, to spend on a can of Coca-Cola, instead of scrimping and saving and sending away to one of these agencies in Africa. Now, there's a lot wrong with this. The most striking thing is that Hank Green uses this kind of cosmology, this view of the universe, this assumption about how the world works, to justify his own decision to eat meat, to justify his own decision to live a life of reckless self-indulgence in other ways too, not just diet, but things like alcohol, things like Coca-Cola, what have you. And the most interesting aspect of the delusion is that he thinks there is something to justify there at all, because he has the power in this way to change the world. Now, I used to be employed in the very small field, very small area of political science called outcome evaluation for humanitarian interventions. You might think that would be a really mainstream area of research, mainstream job to get. What do you do in outcome evaluation for humanitarian intervention? You say, okay, well, look, the United Nations spent so many $1 million on this. Where did the money go? What happened? Where are the outcomes? So many $1 million went into this project. How much of it, one of the biggest questions that everyone's the most important, how much of it just got spent on bureaucracy? How much of it just got spent on people living in air-conditioned offices in Zurich, in New York, in these very expensive places to live in the world, how much of it even got to Cambodia in the first place, right? This could be for any kind of project. It could be for a malaria project, preventable disease. It could be for HIV/AIDS project. Could be for something like a drinking water project, right? Okay, and then you said of the money that remains, 30% of it was going to be used for education, and 30% of it was going to be used for actually building infrastructure, which is like pipes and running water and stuff. Okay, so let's actually go in and examine what happened to the money and what got built and where. In case you can't guess, shockingly little of the money gets spent on the things that it was intended to be spent on. And then even when it does, the outcomes are not what the donors wanted them to be. So I'll give you a specific example from memory. I used to know a lot of these examples. There was a potable water project with this. So potable is a fancy word for water that's safe to drink. And this was in Vientiane, capital city of Laos. And the only beneficiary of this project, it turned out it was paid for by donors, it was a humanitarian project, was the owner of an ice factory. 100% of the new, better quality water generated went into this ice factory, who took the water, froze it, and put it into plastic bags of ice, and then sold this, to bars and restaurants. And that culture is mostly going into beer as ice cubes. So, okay, so when the donors gave this money, and you can imagine the imagery presented to them, they're given images of starving children or something, and did they imagine that this was going to benefit people, one, in the capital city, the wealthiest people in the whole country, not people in remote villages where they might actually be starving or poverty stricken? Two, did they imagine that the sole beneficiary would be the owner of this ice factory, who is probably connected to the government, who is probably a Communist Party apparatchik because this is a communist country, so on and so forth? And did they think that the glorious outcome of this was that the wealthiest people in this third world country would then get to buy this purified water in the form of an ice cube to add to their Coca-Cola or their beer, as the case may be? All right. And this is not the darkest example. This is not the worst example. There are humanitarian interventions that do more harm than good. There are humanitarian interventions that end in total failure. How would you know? Who would tell you? The people who are paying to put that advertisement on TV, do you think they're going to tell you? Do you think they're going to do that kind of research? It's an incredibly important area of research. And there have been discussions in some countries about mandating, making it obligatory to set aside a certain percentage of the budget for outcome evaluation. So that, again, of course, in a sense, this reduces the effectiveness of donations, because now you're donating money and 30% of the money gets spent figuring out what happened to the money after you donated it. But nevertheless, when you don't do that, without even getting into the potential for outright corruption, for money to just disappear into people's pockets entirely, the real outcomes, the real benefits, on the one hand, they're hard to trace. On the other hand, nobody involved wants to trace them. This is the year 2023. History's been going on for a long time. What if at one point in history, there was a need for humanitarian intervention so dire, there were opportunities to make the world a better place so widespread and so deep, that just $1 could make a difference? Well, this is total fiction. Let's just say in the year 1985, that was true. Let's just say. But then over time, as year after year went by, there were just so many assholes like Bill Gates who jumped to the front of the line, these do-gooders with their millions of dollars, that those opportunities for you to make a difference with a donation of just $1, they all disappeared. They were all taken. So to put it this way, the low-hanging fruit was already picked. What if there was a time, whether you think this is 1985 or maybe 1785 would be better, right? When the need for government intervention in the production of clean water, in the provision of the necessities to avoid malaria and cholera and so on, these problems, when the need was so extreme that just $1 could make a difference. But now here we are in the year 2023. God, the cat's out of the bag. The secret is out there. How do you prevent malaria? How do you prevent cholera? How do you provide people with potable drinking water? The technology, guys, you can get the technology for free on the internet. You can figure this stuff out. The governments of the world, even a government like Iran, even a government like Cambodia, they have budgets in the many millions of dollars. They really have a huge capacity to carry out these interventions. And in case you didn't know, certainly a poverty-stricken country like Cambodia, they receive assistance from other governments like Japan, governments like Australia. They provide technical expertise, they provide money in building these things. What if in the year 2023, it's not that it's completely impossible that your $1 would make a difference, but those opportunities have already been taken, have already disappeared. So your $1 that could have made a big difference in 1883 and could have made a bigger difference in 1783 and 1883, already in 1983, the opportunity to make such a big difference was starting to disappear from the world. And now it's gone. How you see these problems changes when you put the issue of possibility first and foremost. When you think in terms of what is possible as opposed to what is impossible. Well, I don't know how I would feel if I lived in the, again, propaganda created delusionary world Hank Green inhabits, where you actually believe, he ostensibly, he actually believes there is more moral significance to his buying a can of Coca-Cola than his decision to be vegan or non-vegan. That's what he believes. He's wrong, like quantitatively and qualitatively, like ethically and politically, in terms of outcomes, in terms of everything else. He is, shall we say, it's not even so much that he's wrong, he is incorrect. The question here is, are we going to be sane or insane? How is it possible that the world can be a better place only by me living in voluntary poverty, only by my decision to renounce the paltry indulgence of a can of Coca-Cola, and not, for example, imposing that on the people of Iran, on the people of Cambodia, on the people of Laos themselves, that you are not going to these third world countries, each and every one of which has a wealthy elite class, and each and every one of which has a middle class too, that you are not going to Cambodia and say, shame. How can you drink a can of Coca-Cola? How can you drink a bottle of beer? How can you drink a cocktail or what have you? How can you spend even $1 on yourself when your own countrymen are dying of malaria, living in poverty, dying? Yes, mysterious, isn't it? Mysterious that it's only you and I here in the decadent West are supposed to adopt this strange form of monasticism for the benefit of the presumably downtrodden and poverty-stricken people of the third world. Now, the real complexity, the real problems to be overcome in eliminating poverty, in as much as that's possible, the complexities to be overcome in eliminating malaria, right? Those complexities cannot be overcome with $1 from you, and they can't be overcome with $1 million from Bill Gates. Now, irony of ironies, I can give you an example that comes back to veganism. What you need for malaria to be a problem is a massive breeding population of mosquitoes with constant access to mammalian blood. Now, I've read numerous studies dealing with this. In the jungles of Myanmar, this is probably past tense now, but in the past, when there were big expanses of intact jungle in Myanmar, Laos, what have you. Remarkably, when you were out in the jungle, there was no malaria. Right? There'd be malaria in an urban center, but not out in the jungle. Now, in the jungle, there are pythons, there are bears, there were tigers. They're now basically extinct. There were elephants. But you didn't have enough mammals available in enough numbers to maintain the kind of cloud of constant breeding population of mosquitoes where malaria is being transmitted between the mosquitoes, and then it's being transmitted back and forth between mosquitoes and people. So this has always been an important dynamic. Why do you think it is that throughout Africa, throughout Arabia, why do you think it is that as they adopt the American diet, as a larger and larger percentage of their diet becomes cow meat and pig meat, that the rates of malaria go up? Why do you think it is? Do you think it's possible that having millions of cattle in sheds, millions of pigs in sheds where they are defenseless against mosquitoes? It's very different than having wild pigs living in the jungle. It is. They are standing there inert in a cage. It's the ideal laboratory to breed the maximum number of mosquitoes possible. And even worse, those mosquitoes have intermittent but frequent access to human beings, right? Because there are humans who work on the farm, right? So this is a great example of how just adding money to the equation won't solve the problem. Now, it doesn't really matter if we're talking about Africa, Arabia, or where I was in Laos and Cambodia. I can tell you, I have been in villages that had no history of cattle farming whatsoever. I mean, they knew what a cow was, but barely. And in case you didn't know, when the French showed up, this happened both in Laos and Cambodia, they ate all the cows because French people were accustomed to eating beef all the time. And then there was this struggle to okay, well, now the cows have been driven to local extinction. Do they import cows from India? Do they import them from Europe? There's a very different breeds of cows. And the genesis of cattle herding in a country like Laos or Cambodia, it very much happened in response to French colonialism. And now in the post-communist era, it's basically a new kind of colonialism, whatever you want to say. They're actively imitating, American farming methods and American meat products and so on. Japan, similar history. There's still a monument to this day to the first cow ever slaughtered in the history of Japan. They had no cattle at all in any of the Japanese islands. And in response to the first American ambassador to Japan, a diplomat, they slaughtered a cow in order to provide him with beef, this one man. And that was the beginning of Japanese, cattle farming that continues to this day and has become famous. Okay, so you cut down the jungle, you eliminate traditional forms of subsistence agriculture. Subsistence is a fancy word for living in poverty, in case you know. And you tell these people, and the United Nations themselves are very active in doing this. It's not only the United Nations, but the United Nations is there actively teaching them how to imitate European and American farming methods, right? Say, hey, you want to get rich? You want to live like these farmers in Texas? Guess what you got to do? They even provide, at a charitable basis, all of the equipment third world countries need. And it's heavy equipment. This is heavy steel equipment. So you can have modern Western forms of cattle farming, pig farming. They provide them with the breeds also. And I've met and talked to people doing this as well as reading, the publications, the progress reports that come out year after year. Yes, well, there are some side effects to that. And I've been in these villages. There is a small little river, a small little creek, and it used to be the one joy in life for the people living in poverty in this area was that they could go down and swim in that little river, in that creek. And they swim and they bathe and they wash their clothes. That's the only laundry they have is to go and, it's literally true, beat their clothes against a rock. They put their clothes in the water and beat it. And one of the great joys is being next to a fast-flowing river in a hot tropical country. You cool off and you enjoy life. Yes, well, once you have several hundred or several thousand cattle living on the side of that river, things change. You can't drink the water anymore. You don't really want to bathe in it. You don't really want to wash your clothes in it anymore. You've ruined the town's only natural resource. You've taken the only joy of life. But invisibly, you've made a population available to the mosquitoes that was not there before. You're increasing the number of mosquitoes. So look, this is a great example. If you donate $1, if you donate $1 million, again, whether this is in Africa, Arabia, or Northern Laos, you can't actually address this problem without saying to people, hey, doesn't even matter if it's based on the basis of the vegan diet or not. By maintaining this population of captive animals at all times, you are giving yourselves malaria. You are making it impossible to prevent malaria. And you also make yourself miserable by living surrounded by thousands and thousands of mosquitoes. Then life wasn't like that before. There were mosquitoes around, but there was some natural balance. And by the way, one of the great things with the tropics is you have insectivorous bats. You have bats that eat mosquitoes, and that is a huge help. You can tell the difference when you're in a village that's next to a cave full of bats. It's a big, big difference in terms of just a number of mosquitoes making your life miserable all day and all night. So what is your $1 going to do? What is your $1 going to accomplish? And then how do you live with that fable? So I've mentioned repeatedly recently this non-vegan YouTube channel that is just called An Unrepentant Atheist. His name is Stuart. So Stuart has a video up, even though he is not vegan himself, and he mentions in the video that he's not vegan. Stuart summarizes the mind-blowingly stupid conversation between Cosmic Skeptic, a YouTuber, and Peter Singer. Now, sadly, within the last 10 years, two of the most influential people in the vegan movement were Cosmic Skeptic and Peter Singer. And from my perspective, they're not just non-vegan, they're actually anti-vegan. They're actually enemies of veganism within the movement. I won't digress to say why. I've made other videos talking about this on my channel. But they agree with each other. They agree with each other that there is this fundamental moral tension in their lives because Cosmic Skeptic gives the example, he enjoys going out for cocktails. He doesn't specify. I assume the cocktail costs a lot more than $1. Depends on what kind of bar you go to. It could be $15, it could be $25, it could be $40 for a cocktail, depending on where you're at. We were in New York recently. There are some $50 cocktails out there. But anyway, it depends how many you drink. You can easily spend hundreds of dollars on cocktails. But Cosmic Skeptic gives the example of going out for cocktails. And he believes that he lives in a world in which his decision not to drink a cocktail, that little bit of money he saved up, can make this kind of crucial, decisive difference, whether it be for starving children, preventable disease, making the world. Okay. Now, you tell me, am I an optimist or a pessimist? Because I know that's not true. I know it's not true. And I know that all of these people are quite literally brainwashed by propaganda, by advertising they saw on television as children, and that there is no other substance to this whatsoever. It is crucial to this delusion that we only imagine far off exotic places, Cambodia, Africa, what have you, that we exoticize poverty itself, that we exoticize disease itself. If I asked you guys to donate $1 a day to prevent the common cold in Michigan, none of you would do it. You understand the common cold too well. I can't take your dollar, I can't take $1 from each of you and make any fucking difference with the spread of the common cold in Michigan. I can't. Again, this exoticization goes on. The single most pressing problem in every major city in the United States of America is drug addiction. For some reason, we have not seen a new generation of these advertisements saying, oh, if you could just give up a cup of coffee a day, if you could give up a can of Coke a day, for your $1 a day, together we can solve methamphetamine addiction, cocaine addiction, crack addiction, heroin addiction, fentanyl addiction. Nobody would believe it. So we just saw the city budget for Los Angeles, I believe it was. I'm sorry. Okay, I shouldn't even specify the city. Yeah, I'm sorry. But for one of the major cities in America, we saw that they had a $1.3 million budget for 1 year to deal with this problem. And guess what? It's not going to be solved for $1.3 million, and it's not going to be solved for $10 million. I think that was LA, but I'm sorry, I forgot. It could have been San Francisco. I've been getting the news from a lot of different cities in America. But this particular city, and this was like $1.3 million, and their total budget for social services, I think was only $13 million. So it was like, whoa, it's perfect. This is a significant, of all the money you have to help all kinds of different problems, a big chunk of it is being set aside to deal with drug addiction case. If this problem could be solved by Bill Gates donating millions of dollars to it, it would be solved. And you can all visualize just how hard it would be for Bill Gates to make any difference with the fentanyl addiction problem, with any of these, with cocaine addiction or whatever. People, again, I think they do want to help, but on the one hand, they don't know what to do. And after a few years' experience in the charity game, they figure out exactly what doesn't work, what they can't do. And they end up, in his case, they end up focusing on like providing books for childhood education, because here's a difference you can actually make. There was another guy who was one of the co-creators of The Simpsons, the TV show, The Simpsons, and he was incredibly wealthy. He was fabulously wealthy. And he was one of those guys who was diagnosed with a fatal disease that took a very long time to kill him. So I forget what it was, but he kind of knew he only had 10 years to live, and then he actually lived for 20 years. One of those situations. So after a certain point, he just devoted his life to charity. And the interesting thing is, he got more and more cynical and more pissed off as he saw he was donating money and it just disappears and nothing is accomplished. I mean, he was smart enough. He lived long enough to watch what happened. And this is, again, this comes back to veganism in a funny way. He ended up focusing all of his donations on rescuing and rehabilitating circus animals. That there were elephants and so on living in really horrible conditions in the circus, or they used to be in a circus and now nobody wants them anymore. And the reason he gave for this was, look, I give $1 million for this. I can actually see some outcome. And you know what? All these years of experience where you donate money to a cause, and it's just money going into another person's pocket. You know, there are no measurable outcomes, right? Now, again, this is the year 2023. This is going to sound preposterous, but just stick with me for a sentence and a half. What if it were possible in the year 1885 to prevent drug addiction by donating $1 a day? What if it had been possible in the year 1985 to prevent the cocaine addiction epidemic, to prevent methamphetamine, to prevent PCP? What if $1 at the right time, if only Bill Gates had donated the money at that time? But today, in 2023, all the money that possibly could be donated to solve this problem, whether it be by private foundations, by wealthy millionaires like Bill Gates, or money donated by governments, unimaginable quantities. Try to add up how much money, the governments, plural, of the United States of America, the governments of Europe have spent on this. And over so many years of so much bitter experience. And you start to realize that this is not a problem that can be solved by throwing money at it. And if at any stage in history it were a problem that could be solved this way, it already would have been solved. So this comes back to my repeatedly urged premise. I made a video with this in the title the other day. You have to learn to focus on the difference that you can make. You have to start thinking in terms of what is possible and impossible, even in your ethical judgments, even in your moral evaluations of the world, not just strategy and tactics, right? Back in the year 2001, September, October, November, December, that time, 2001, what is for the United States military, for the people of Afghanistan? Americans never think this way. Americans absolutely never think in terms of what's possible. Now, if you guys don't know, I'm not a peacenik. I'm not an anti-interventionist. On the contrary, I am the most pro-CIA person I've ever met. Okay? I really am. I like the CIA so much, I fucking applaud them for assassinating JFK. It was a good... I like the CIA more than I like JFK. You look at what it's possible for the government of the United States of America to do, for the military of the United States of America to do, for the people of Afghanistan. And my answer is not nothing. I would not say there is nothing they can do for the people of Afghanistan, right? But the budgets for those wars over 19 years exceeded $1 trillion. So if we were having this debate, hey guys, why don't you guys donate money to help the people of Afghanistan? It's only the cost of a can of Coke. It's only the cost of a cup of coffee. Back in the year 1999, let's say, we could have easily done a telethon for that cause. We could have easily had advertisements on TV say, look, here's the suffering of the people of Afghanistan. Here's how tough it is. Here's how difficult it is for teenage girls to get an education. Here are all the diseases they're dying of. People are malnourished. Here's how terrible life is in Afghanistan and the Taliban. Why won't you give up a cup of coffee? Why won't you give up a cocktail and donate your money to me back in 1999 so that we can save and uplift and transform the poor, benighted people of Afghanistan? If you really understand political science, if you really understand humanitarian work, you could look at that situation, you could analyze it in 1999, and you could say, look, this is not going to change for $1. You're not going to be able to do this for $1,000. You are not going to be able to achieve these outcomes for $1 million, for $1 billion, not even for $1 trillion. You are not going to take Afghanistan and transform it into Belgium, not even for $1 trillion. And I point out, we all understand this implicitly because nobody blames Bill Gates for the failure of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. Nobody looks at Bill Gates and say, Bill Gates, you fucking hypocrite. If only you had donated another $1 million to women's education in Afghanistan, if only you had donated $1 million to improve the level of health, education, the economy, what do you want to put it down to? If only Bill Gates had donated another $1 million to transform Afghanistan into a better, more modern, more moderate country. If only that $1 million had been donated at the right time, then what a wonderful place Afghanistan could be today. All right? There's a deep cultural problem in the United States of America wherein Americans only think about what's possible last. And you've got to train yourself to start thinking about what's possible first. It is in the context of understanding the difference we can make, what's possible and what's impossible, that we can look at someone like Hank Green and what he did in relation to veganism and the vegan message. We can look at people like Cosmic Skeptic and Peter Singer, traitors within the vegan movement, enemies of veganism, right at the heart, the pinnacle of power and influence in the movement. We can look at them and say, what you're doing is not just counterproductive. It's fundamentally evil. Because when you understand the difference you can make ethically, ecologically, and politically, it is in that context that veganism is of unique and indeed overwhelming significance, rather than being just a minor lifestyle change like giving up a can of Coca-Cola so that you can donate it to a United Nations agency that pays every single one of its employees more than the highest paid bureaucrat in Switzerland, Luxembourg, Singapore, or the United States of America to sit in an air-conditioned office and pretend that they're saving the world. Saving the world is up to you, and it's up to me. And we have to start making hard choices and taking big risks and making big sacrifices. A can of Coke is not going to do it.